Thank you. And thanks for coming. I'm glad there's a lot of you here, not just a couple. So I'm going to talk about drawing mostly, and I'm going to do some demonstrations to show the way that I draw and what I think of when I draw. But before I do, for anybody that doesn't know my work, I'll show you a couple of things, and I think it'll put in context why and how I conceptualize form and think when I draw. So I always wanted to do large multi-figure paintings when I came to Florence. I looked in the churches, I went to the museums, and I just could not figure out how these guys did these things that they did. So I spent years trying to figure it out and eventually came up with an approach and a way of thinking about anatomy and light and form that worked for me. So we'll look at a few of my paintings first here. And what you'll see is the kind of conception of composition and anatomy and using the figure to tell a story that was central to everything I've been trying to do and everything that I really took in when I was here in Florence. Okay, so these are the sketches for a big series of paintings I'm doing now. That when they're all finished, they'll be about 40 feet for Americans, and for everybody else, that's something like 10.5 meters, 11, 12, 13 meters. And this is an allegory I was building up based on the traditions of Florentine art, which had a heavy, heavy emphasis on allegory and the kind of admixture of Christian, Greek, Roman, alchemical symbolism to tell a story. So that's something that you can see when you walk around the churches here and the Palazzo Vecchio. It's filled with paintings like this. And I wanted to bring that back because I haven't seen it for a while. So this is a painting that I'm working on now. And when it comes to drawing the figure, you have a particular set of challenges on a painting this size and scale and complexity, because the figures have to flow together into forms, right? You'll see there's big shapes and big masses and they're grouped together. Because if you don't do that, you end up with chaos. You end up with a gigantic mess of just figure and figure and figure that aren't working together. They're not dancing together. They have no music. And so when you get to this, you have to be able to control the form a little bit, because you've got to work things together. You've got to make shapes out of these that aren't necessarily the shapes that your model is giving you. So let's go to the next one. And this is another painting I did, which had a whole different set of problems. This is dealing with light. So the figures are a little more harmonized by the way the light is falling through the center of the plane, and different figures are dropping into shadow. But it's the same basic conception. When you start to do these kind of paintings, you need to think, in a sense, in 3 dimensions. You need to be able to map out your space, essentially a 3D model in your head. And that's what I was doing with this particular painting called Quebec, which is a big historical epic of all the things that happened in Quebec over the years, leading up to a bunch of drama in the 60s and 70s. And here I am in the corner, hiding out. And actually there I am again with my back turned, posing as a terrorist. So let's move on to the next one. Switch. Okay, so now this is another painting that is just one more introduction to kind of what I'm doing. I'm painting a lot of mythological paintings, a lot of nudes, and basically building on what I got here. But if you can see, I'm bringing out the rhythms of the figures. If a figure is turning, I'm really conscious that it turns and it flows and it bends and they have a lot of movement. And that's something that, again, we'll talk about when I start drawing from the model, that you really need to have a mental conception, a good form conception, to get the life and the breathing into your figure. You'll notice a thing where certain figures, you draw them and they're standing there and they're very well rendered. And you look at it, you go, okay, that's good, that's not bad, right? That seems competent. But it's not great. It doesn't have life. It doesn't breathe. You don't feel the weight and the muscles tensing and relaxed in the right spots. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, is how to get to that next step with your figure drawing, so you actually feel the built-in structures and movement and weight and positioning, and the figure comes to life. And there's particular reasons that doesn't happen, which I'm going to talk about. All right, let's do the next guy here. Okay. This is another one I did a while back of Orpheus and Eurydice, where his lover has died, and he goes down to hell to bring her back. He loves her so much, he's just crazy about her. He's a bit needy. And so he decides, I'm going to get her he manages to play music so beautifully that they release her from hell. But as she's coming out, he knows, he's been told, that if he turns around to look at all of the sounds coming from behind, they're going to take her back. And at some point, he can't help but look. So the demons come out and they pull her back down into hell. And that's what this painting is. And this figure, these were actually inspired by, there's a sculpture by Canova that I saw in Vienna of Hercules and somebody, it's slipping my mind right now. But it has a beautiful dramatic movement of the leg planted, pulling another figure over its head. And that's something you can do. I took that as the basis for my pose, and then I built an entire composition around it. If you can see swirling and circles, and all of these figures had to fit into that pattern for it to make sense. And once you develop the ability to like control the form, which is what I'm going to talk about here, you can actually exaggerate the turns of the figure. You can change the proportions slightly. You can expand and contract, and you'll do all of this because you'll essentially take your model and you'll widen it, but you'll do it in 3 dimensions, so all of the axes and all of the tilts will still line up properly and be believable, even if it's not exactly what you see in front of you in the model. Okay, so let's go on here to the next one. Okay, this is another painting. Basically, we're just starting to see more of the same thing, so you can get some examples of what's possible. This piece was all about backlighting, dramatically coming in, and I had to conceptualize how all of these figures would look in this scene, imagining them in place, imagining the perspective, and imagining the geometry of the light, from which direction it's coming, and how it would roll over the forms. Because even if you're going to use a model, this is the thing you have to learn. Because the perspective of a figure standing in the back is very different than the perspective of a figure down on the ground. You're looking down on one, and the other one is up above your head. So you have to be able to put all of that together from the very beginning when you make a composition. You always have to be aware of where your eye is, where everything else is, and even down to the light, it's really important. If you have a figure's torso, and you're looking up at it, and the light's coming from behind, that top plane that's catching the light isn't going to be visible, right? It's going to turn away from you. If you're looking down on them, you're actually going to see around to the back plane where there's more light. So this is all related. The building of the whole world and the building of the individual figure are basically, like Da Vinci said, scientific. So over the years of doing this, I've tried to develop a way to draw the figure that's essentially scientific, with no guesswork. So you can go at it and know exactly where things are going to be. So it's very hard to miss your drawing. It's predictable. And it is predictable because nature's predictable. It's rational. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, this is just one more. We'll just take a minute here. This is starting to work architecture and perspective into the same scenes. We're on the next. Yeah, I think I've repeated myself enough. Just one more here. We'll just go to the next one. A little drawing just to show the kind of drawings that I do before the painting usually. So this is where I like to solve all of my problems before I get into it. Okay, now this is a painting I just finished, and I'm going to go a little more in depth on this because I have pictures of all the drawings here ready to go. And this is really an example of what I was talking about, right? There's figures that are way down at the bottom. There's figures like the whale that are way over the top. Very Venetian, kind of Tiepolo, Tintoretto like that. Right? Really playing with the drama of space and even slightly fisheyeing it and exaggerating it to play up the drama, which is another thing you have to keep in mind when you're working this way, is there's one point that's accurate, right? All perspective goes there. However, if you're drawing and you're designing and you realize you may not hit that one point perfectly, it can be, like hitting a target with an arrow that's 100 meters away. What you can always do is lean into it and push things a little bit. And that's actually where a lot of the life and drama in a figure and a setting come from, is if you take what's there, and if you're looking down on these figures, you end up looking more down on it, right? So you lean into the drama, you lean into the perspective. And I'll show you some of the work I'm getting here. I did a bunch of drawings. This is all painted from drawings. And so these are the drawings that I did. And you can see they're a little bit linear. I typically don't go in and finish backgrounds and do all these kind of things because these drawings are used for paintings predominantly. So none of that's necessary. Let's go to the next one. Okay, this is another figure in it. Here's another one. And so you can see these are all constructed from individual poses. And then when they're all put together, they've been conceptualized in the right space from the right perspective with the right light from the very beginning. And then each drawing can be developed and put together. And afterwards, it just goes right into the painting. And I find it's a really good practice to do that, because having drawn the figure, if you really figure it out, you have something much better to work from than a photograph, or I mean, people get a live model. These poses are good luck. But because you've resolved it in a way, you know, in the process of drawing, you found the key elements, and you're not having to think about everything at the same time. You know, you can do the lines. You can really go in and find the perspective and the movement and the anatomy, and get it exactly right, and then lay the light over the top of it. And it allows you to break the tasks down. And once you've broken your tasks down into one thing at a time, you can be fully expressive with each of those individual tasks. Where if I was sitting here thinking about, you know, getting my dramatic light and tonal values at the very beginning, I would not have my brain free enough to go in and really capture the forms that I wanted to get in these figures, for instance. You know, I was really conscious, thinking almost like Rubens, of overlaps, what's going to give you the sense of space, making sure that his drapery overlaps his leg, which is then kind of overlapped by his body, and using every tool possible to create a three-dimensional effect. So this is a little introduction to what I do, and now I'm going to talk to you about how to do it. And can you just put your arm in my coat so I can see your whole torso? Yeah, that's great. That's good. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is to talk about when you're drawing for composition. It's a little bit different. You know, you're usually not approaching it quite in the academic way where you're taking and measuring every little thing. And when I do these drawings, I usually go pretty quick. I spend maybe 5-6 hours on a drawing to the point that it's finished. Because I have to make a lot. I've got to make 10, 12, 15, 20 drawings to complete a large painting. And so what you have to do in order to draw like that is you need to get your mind very quick and very focused. And you have to know what you're looking for. And the way you do that is you build a conception of form. That's the key to everything. You have to have a conception of form. Because you do, no matter what. This is the thing, it's inescapable in your head. When you close your eyes and you go to draw, you're going to find that there's a built-in model that's predictable, and everybody has it of what the figure looks like. And to just sort of give an example, if I just put in the main lines of this pose here, there's some sort of actions happening in there, right? That are very simple. And in the fewest lines, we can establish what's happening here. And that's based on our geometric concept of what the form is. So, a basic form concept, something really simple like this, is about a volume with a particular tilt in space. And we know that by the center line. How far off center is it? Which tells us how the volume is turning this way around, right? And we know the direction of the center line. Is it going off center this way? Is it vertical? Is it tipping that way? Every volume will have a trajectory in space and axis turning around it. And this is really important because what happens with a naive form conception, we can say, is that I would draw that, and I would straighten it, and I would flatten it, and I would lose the tilt of his hips. This is exactly the kind of, this is where your brain starts from zero. It starts with a desire to make everything flat, central, horizontal, and lacking movement. This is what it likes. And so what will happen with that is when you're drawing, you can start with the correct gesture. But when you're not paying attention, if your brain drifts a little bit, if you don't measure one point, what's going to happen is this tilt, as you start, you look at the detail and you say, okay, his external oblique is here, his other external oblique on the other side is here, but no, maybe it's wrong. I think I need to change the shape. I'm going to just bring it here. And now that doesn't feel right because now the belly button is not in the right place next to it. So I better like push the belly button kind of, maybe I'll move it in here. And what you're going to find is that all mistakes in drawing are predictable and they're always the same. 99% of your drawing mistakes are going to be raising this side, slightly lowering that side, and bringing the belly button back into the center so you can establish equilibrium. And you lose the movement. Because our brain, until we've educated, doesn't understand perspective and movement. So you can watch this as you draw, you'll be shocked. I teach drawing, and it's absolutely the case that every single mistake almost follows the rules exactly as you expect them to be followed. So the solution to that is to give yourself a more sophisticated form conception. So as you start to drift into the details, instead of losing the life of the drawing and losing the perspective of the drawing, you actually can hold on to it and even accentuate it to make it more dramatic. So what that looks like is when you come to the point that, let's just start with the hips here, because this tilt on his hips is fantastic. So this angle is something that you would start from the very beginning, right? And if you look at it, the first thing that's going to happen is your brain is going to underestimate how dramatic it is. Because again, it likes security, it doesn't like action, it doesn't like things that are off-center, it makes it uncomfortable, which is true for our brains in general. If anybody suddenly walks up to you and does something very kind that you're not expecting, if you have low self-esteem, you're immediately going to question it. Like, what the hell are you trying to pull on me, right? Because it goes outside of your mental conception of how reality works. And so, technical difficulties. Okay. So we'll just talk a little bit about this, right? The other one is the center line. It's hugely important. If you look at the thrust of his body, if you can get the center line in there and then not lose it, making sure it is off center. That's the other one everybody screws up. The minute they start drawing stomach muscles, it's just the easiest, most predictable thing in the world. Those stomach muscles start to creep back towards the center of the body instead of being off center. I'll just stiff it.
But can I have white beans? Like white?
Does anybody have anything stronger? Vodka, whiskey, white. We'll just draw on top of drawing on top of drawing. And so the first thing that we want to look at here is...
Transfer as an answer? Did you get that up?
Okay, so I'm just going to talk for a minute. I'm going to explain to you.
Thank you, baby white.
I wouldn't use these on your baby.
And it takes
We put those on baby.
poor babies.
Okay. So when I draw, let's see if I can. That's okay. This will be like a solar monochrome. Okay. So these are the things that I think of when I draw. I begin the very beginning with a movement of the entire conception of the volume in space. Now this is mostly concerned with the direction and thrust of the entire volume. You can think of the torso as a bit of a two-part masses connected by a slinky in the middle, something flexible, an accordion, right? So we have a mass coming down. There's a bit of a flexible area here. You can see where the external obliques are. And then you have the tilt of the hips. And it's really important that you get that right. Because what you can decide in this is the simplest things. How wide is his chest based on how tall is it? Very simple thing. This is massive. You're creating a massive claim. How wide are the hips? How big is the space in between generally compared to the top? Now you want to be pretty loose about this in the beginning because what you're really after is you have to make sure that the whole thing has the right flow of space. The whole volume of his body is tipped slightly that way in this pose. The whole thing is turned slightly that way in this pose. That's what I need to get, because what I'm going to do is once I have the center line, the basic proportions of the masses, I'm conceptualizing this as a large round volume. Now, I've got enough at this point, and the axis, that's the other thing, sorry. The axis of the hips and the axis of the ribs. Because once you have that, everything's predictable. This is how you build a three-dimensional model. You mark the front center, you mark the side center, and you look for the axes that are cutting across it, that are going to be the same all the way across the rib cage. Because the human figure is bones and meat, right? The bones don't move much. The meat is very flexible. So you base all of your conceptions on these bones. When you get down to the hips, the same is true here. Across from his iliac crest is going to come across to the iliac crest. The pubic bone is going to be on the same axis. Everything is going to be built three-dimensionally. And now, once you have that, is where it gets complicated and interesting, because now you come in to adding the smaller forms into the big form. And this is where you have to really emphasize the three-dimensional constructive aspect of things. Because if you don't, again, your let's say, uneducated form sense is going to pull you back to the flat, right? So you're going to start adding things in, and as you do it, you're going to lose your tilt, you're going to come back to center, and you're going to bring your center line back to the middle until you've created an Egyptian figure, which you don't want. So what you do is when you have the nipples here, you have the frontal plane, you've got the tilts. You actually start to build your smaller forms directly onto that conception. You don't have to look at every form and say, where is this rib cage? Where's this rib here? You know, I'm just going to guess. I'm going to put a dark in here. What you actually do is you keep in mind the geometry of the volume in space, and you look at it and you say, here's the center line, here's the side line, the exact side, and it's right in between. So you know exactly you're going to drop that on both sides. This is a prominent point on the rib cage that you can always see on the model, and it's a good one to look for because it gives you the symmetry, right? You can see the tilt between the two of them. So if you get those right, then you know you have a correct form in the rib cage. And if I look, that's almost exactly on the quarter mark from the center to the side. So that's the thing. Once you get your volume correct here, you actually just start carving into that volume like a block of stone. And I come to the other side, and I know this is gonna add up on the tilt on the other side, the same point on the rib cage, which is where the second section of the stomach muscles come off. It's predictable. Every single time they're gonna come right off of there. And you're gonna start to see this plane of dark is based on that bone coming up to the sternum, right? So that becomes very predictable, very easy. All it is the center line, let's say a quarter line, because this is the half, marks the half of the whole volume. And then you'll have the same over here and here. And of course on this side, it's turning away from you, right? It's disappearing around the corner in perspective. So what you have to think about then is you have a volume like this, let's say. Let's move this over right there. Carve that in a little bit. And so what's going to happen here is if here's the front, and let's say we mark the side right here, that's the halfway. The half on this side is over there, right? You can't see it, it's behind. So when you find the quarter mark here between the two, it's going to sit there. But on the other side, that same line is coming up and then turning around, right? Everything comes up and turns around the form. So it's going to start to pull back that way. It's going to pull back in. Where this is going to pull back up. So you can map exactly the forms of the anatomy as long as you understand and you follow the perspective. The tilt in space, the center lines, and then again, like I was saying, everything is built on that. You know that's the quarter mark, and that's the quarter mark, and then we're dropping down. You know exactly where the stomach muscles are going to come off of because they attach to that point. And this is a much more sound system than just trying to guess and draw each piece individually, right? Because if you just say, okay, there's a dark here, there's a dark there, there's a bump here, there's a bump there, well, unless you're like getting them exactly perfect because you're kind of a prodigy, you're never going to get an integrity of everything holding together exactly the way it's supposed to hold together. And once you know this, it's science, right? It never changes. It's predictable. You don't, as long as you're thinking of it, you're going to get everything exactly in the right spot. So I'll throw in another kind of weird concept here, looking at bones. This is where we have to think of the perspective getting even a little more complicated. Let's take the idea of a triangle. If we create a plane in space and we divide it in half, well, actually properly divide it in half by making an X, and so we can mark the center line of the X, right? That's a good way to divide a plane in half. Just exit, center line. Now, if we put our top triangle here, we just come to that line. This comes down to there. So now we've created a triangle in perspective. And this kind of thing is really, really important because when we look at the rib cage or you look at the pelvis, if you want to get a good conception of what you're looking at, you realize the rib cage is arching down, but it's also a kind of a triangle in perspective, right? It's moving to the sides and it's moving back. So that's how you have to educate your real three-dimensional sensibility of what the form is. So you know that if you do an arch along here, that's going to be there. But this one is going to be turning surprisingly kind of back in, right? Which isn't what you would expect at first, how strongly that's going to come back. So that means when you come to the side of the figure here, you have to be aware of what's happening to get exactly the right angle. So
sorry to interrupt, but could might the model have a break for?
Yeah, take a break here. So we'll take a look at another one. I'll give you another complicated kind of problem of geometry here that you have to think through to get things right. The collarbones, right? The collarbones are very tricky. It's really easy to get them wrong, and it's easy to have them not feel correct when you look at your drawing. They can just end up, we'll go green, why not? Okay, they can end up looking a bit wonky. So if you think of the collarbones, you need to think of a sort of a bicycle handle, right? They're 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3 like that. They come flat out, they cut back, and they come back out. So in order to understand that in 3 dimensions, you have to, let's sort of give a conception. Well, let's just say it like this. So if I'm looking at the collarbones, 1, 2, 3. So what we're seeing is, again, foreshortening, 3 sections. The one that's turning away from you is going to be very small, right? Coming back to the triangular theory, the side of the triangle that's close to you is elongated. The side that's away is very short, and then you can see again 1, 2, 3. So you need to think of these kind of movements out, back, very, very small, and then out again. You have to think of this kind of 3-dimensional stuff when you draw. And then once you do, you can push it a little bit. I think it's a good idea to try exaggerating a little bit in your drawings, because if you have a figure, like I'm saying, turning this way on the rib cage, and your tendency, if you remember, is always to go flat. It's always to bring things back to center, to lose the tilt of things. One way to compensate for that is to actually push into the tilts a little bit. That was something I learned years ago when I was studying portrait painting, was the turn to the side. We would almost always add too much on the far side, and we'd always try to exaggerate we'd always try to straighten the center line, let's say, right? So if the head was tilted like this would grow, this side would shrink, and the center line would turn back up to the top. And the form that would often take is if you have a sort of a, let's say just a very general shape of a head here, and you have eyes, and you have a nose, and you have a mouth, is this side of the mouth gets long, even though it should be short. This side stays where it is. The nose slowly creeps back to the center, even though it's supposed to be on the axis tipping over there. This eye gets too big, and this one you just get confused because your nose is off and the eye is off and you don't know what to do, so it can sit right in here. So these are really common things. So what you can do to compensate for these is push a little farther, you know. If you have a head that's turned and tilted to the side, really push that center line off. Really tilt the axis down. And what you're going to find is you're actually going to be more accurate, oftentimes, because you're going to compensate for your brain wanting to bring you back to center. So, does anybody have, we'll wait for the model for a minute, but in the meantime, does anybody have a question?
Do you put perspective grids on your canvases? If so, like how detailed are they?
Yeah, if I do them, if I'm doing architecture, then yeah, they've got to be really detailed and really good. And it's a good thing to do perspective grids in general, because you'll find that it trains your brain, you know, it's a little more manageable. When you get into the figure, you're dealing with moving perspective. You have to get it, but you don't have to grid the figure. You know, you can just sort of get the general axis and the tilts in space, and things will land in the right spot. With architecture, everything has to be flawless. But it's good because it gets you into the basics. It's also great for training yourself for paint application, because with architecture, you have to there's nothing but neatness and perfection involved in painting it once you figured out how the light and the perspective goes. So you have to really handle your brushes and paint consistency well to do it. So it's a good training in general. Okay, let's see. So I'm just going to develop this mess slightly here. Let's get rid of this color from the illustration. Okay, so your shorts were a bit lower. I could see your top of your hips less than. Yeah. Okay. So getting into this idea of building again, I've got my center line coming down through here. I've got this tilt, right? You can see all the way across the form. And I'm keeping that tilt onto the shoulders. They're going to be symmetrical in the same direction as the tilt across all of the ribs. With one little thing, the shoulders are mobile. So you have to factor that in. You know, one shoulder can go up and the other shoulder can go down. Okay. And so having the center line, having my side line, the other side line is there, but it's turned behind the body. I'm marking the bottom of the rib cage. This is really important stuff because the rib cage never changes again, right? The flesh moves, it's flexible. Every little shift in his body is going to change it. But the rib cage is not. Marking the iliac crest. And then, like I said, coming through kind of on a line with the nipples is about the quarter mark on the way to the hair, around the body, right? So if this is the pure side, that's right in between. And I know that this is my center line. I have my angle in space, right? So everything's going to follow that same angle in space. So dropping down to here, this is about the opening of the rib cage here is just slightly above, maybe a quarter to a third, a half. Here's the quarter. I can see exactly where these sit. This is exactly halfway between the quarter and halfway down to the opening of the rib cage. So I can place this here, I can place this here, and I can see that kind of there's a muscle tensing right down to there. So again, there's no guesswork here. I'm not just stabbing in the dark, right? I'm building a three-dimensional model and placing things on top of that model. One other thing to consider when you think about your drawing and the way that you will screw up a form, if an arm's coming directly at you, and you have a cylinder of the arm, right? It's reaching at you. But what happens in the perspective is it becomes very short. You don't see the whole length of the arm, right? You see it compressed into about this much. And what the brain likes to do with that, let's say that this arm was coming towards us and there was a hand coming out here, and you say, okay, that arm is very short. What your brain will then do is it will shrink it. It'll make that arm almost like a stump because it'll say, okay, it's short, so it should be wide. What you have to remember about perspective, again, is if you have a bump like this, and you foreshorten it, so that this length becomes this length, it still has the same height, right? So it changes its shape to this. So every time something's coming towards you in space, if it's a shoulder or whatever it is, it's going to become like overlapping, compressed form, especially with somebody who has muscular development. I mean, you'll see that these forms on the arm will suddenly become much fuller and much rounder, and that's because of the perspective operating. So it's something, again, you have to train yourself to see, because if you don't, you will miss it. And here's another thing to look at, right? Keeping that off center. This is very much exaggerated in length on this side compared to this side. It's not even drawing anymore, so you'll just have to take my word for it on that front. But you have to push that, and it's a good idea to push it even more than you think. So, let's see. Let me try. So the last thing that I'll do here is just move a little bit into, to the degree it's possible with this pin, I'm going to move a little bit into the idea of light and planes. So as I continue to develop it, I'm usually going to do, you see I'm cutting a little bit off here. That's usually the way to go, is to cut back into your perspective as you start making corrections. Don't let it get away from you. So I'm pushing that here. And having found again the quarter mark, I've essentially established a frontal plane of the body now. And so as I'm starting to look for form, that's going to be a point where a lot of the shadows, they start to fall right on that line, and I can mark them in all the way down. Yeah, this is not going to be great for putting in shadow, but we'll try to get the general idea here. And so you see, I'm now putting the shadows on. And as ugly as they are in this medium, what you can see is the planes and the perspective that I established allow me to simply place the shadows with pretty much getting them in the right place without even really drawing or measuring or doing anything. It's just all mathematics. And I realized that the light, of course, is coming from here, as you guys all know, turning under and turning to the side, it gets darker and eventually turns into shadow. So, having this physical conception allows me to actually have a really accurate idea of it, knowing that the light is hitting on this plane. This plane is, say, 3/4 up around the top of the roll of the form. And so what's going to happen is every time you get to the opposite of that, it's going to turn into shadow. So I can actually conceptualize this as 3 dimensions, and I know, even if I wasn't looking, I would know that when the form turns to this degree, to the side and under, everything goes into shadow. It's predictable, it's easy. So even if the model's breathing, once you've created a geometric kind of model of this, you can just duplicate it over and over and over again. So I think I've done about as much as I can do with this, which isn't much, but does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions about what I'm saying?
As far as the anatomy goes, how far into detail do you have to go about the skeleton?
Okay, yeah. You go into detail. That's the thing. Like when I was talking about the collarbones and understanding them in detail as essentially coming out flat, cutting back and going back again, right? Which means straight, before shortening and then back out again. These things are really important because, again, they don't really change. The shape of the collarbones is always going to be the shape of the collarbones. The shape of the pelvis is always going to be the shape of the pelvis. So the things you have to get right are essentially the perspective, like I'm saying, the axis and tilts, and you have to get the bones right. There's no missing. If you draw in my arm, I'm not a bodybuilder. I don't have like all kinds of crazy stuff going on, but my elbow is my elbow. If you miss that shape, and especially if you miss the perspective of that shape, you'll see in Rubens is fantastic for this. He always finds the bones and he makes them just a little more boxy than they are. And by making it a little more boxy, say at the elbow here, if I find the point of it, and I really get the character of what's going on with that elbow. And I get the character there. And then we come down to the hand, let's say. And I find the, you see? I find the one here and the one here, the almond. Thank you. I don't even remember the names of this stuff anymore. So, if you get that right, you get the little bit of the radius there, I got one here, correct. And you have the elbow correct, and the bones are there in the right way, everything is just going to flow right between them, right? You can put, because you can say, everything's attaching to a bone. They have every muscle has a function. So, if you look here, this is connecting here, wrapping around, coming down to connect onto the corner pulls and it pulls and it pulls. But that also changes form. On every single person, that's going to be different. How strong are you? How thin are you? How fat are you? How young are you? How old are you? So there's a lot of variety there, but not on the bone. So yeah, you really need to know the bones. That's the key thing. If you can draw the skeleton in perspective and get the complexities, like I was saying, if you can really get the complexities of taking a form like this. Okay, we'll try green. Yeah. Okay. And we say, we got the center anyway, right? If you can get this sense of how. So if we can get this sense of how in this angle, angles change. The triangle is shorter on that side. If we come around the cylinder, we come to the side, we come to the side, right? We get a different conception. Let's even cut that in a little bit. And then once we have this, we can widen a little bit, and we can see that something can come out, and then how dramatically it comes back, right? And so if you can get this sense of basic geometry, and you can apply that to the shapes of the bones, let's say, something simple like this. You know, you have a sort of a butterfly shape. This side is very foreshortened because you're not really seeing it. This side, you're seeing that plane comes off much larger. See, that could be the basis of the hips. That could be the basis of the iliac crest, just that simple geometric conception. And that'll help you put everything right into the right place. Coming down to the hip bones, the spine coming off the whole thing. So if you can understand that, you've got the figure 99% of the way. Because again, the muscles are all just kind of connected to their key bone. You can put all the flesh based off of the bone. So I think it's really important. I would spend probably as much time as it takes to memorize the skeleton and then to put it into complex perspective. Same with the skull. You know? If you look at his head and you can kind of reduce it down to the basic forms of the cheekbones, the projection of the chin, your jawbone, then you'll find all those subtle planes of light and shade fall between, like from here, the cheekbone, along the muscle that comes down to make you smile at the corner of your mouth. Right? The flesh just hangs on that. It's predictable. You see how that turns into shadow there along that muscle? On the other side, you have, again, I'm not a big one on names, but the muscle here that you use to chew, you can see how that is a plane that cuts back from the front of the face. So you can find a darkening tone along that plane. Of course, here you have the obvious one, the cheekbone, but it's not actually so obvious until you really go in and study all the subtleties that are going on, right? You have a piece coming down here, and then a second piece coming down here, which you can see there. And then it comes up, and it curves back, it comes back around to the ear, and coming off of it, you have a sort of a bump up on the outside of the brow, and then the cut back along the temple. So all of these forms are there in the bones. And if you're just looking at it, they don't seem so obvious at first, but because they're skeletal, they never change. And because we're humans, we recognize human faces very intently. So if something's missing, your figure now becomes creepy. And you don't know why, you think you did it just right, but people are gonna look at it and just feel that it's not there. You know, like when you see a great portrait, you know it's just works. You see Rembrandt, Ilya Repin, these kind of things, and you go, wow, how did he do that? That's alive. Which is really the difference I'm talking about here, how to make them live. Because you can do a dead one and miss all those little subtleties, and that's why it won't have life, you know? But if you get those little subtleties, if you come into his knee and you recognize that from where I'm standing, I'm looking slightly down on his knee, that there's a plane. Let's make this really geometric. Dropping down. So there's a plane, a top, a kind of narrowing plane dropping down, and then we have another plane here, and then it kind of turns to the side, right? So if you can understand that top plane and that lower plane, now now you can actually really capture the perspective and exactness of the knee shape. And as you go and you start working the subtleties, you're not going to lose it, because you're going to be aware as you start to model, things can just kind of morph in different directions. You'll be keeping in mind what that perspective is of that box, and you'll make sure you're describing that box. So then what's going to happen is you're going to have the knee of the model in your drawing, and it's going to be way more believable, because you'll have caught the form, you'll have made sure it's in perfect perspective, and the subtleties, even as you wrap around the modeling of the knee, you'll be aware that there is a plane that you're not seeing here, right? Which doesn't sound important, but if you look over here, it is, because there's this very delicate side plane. And in order to really understand that form, you have to analyze it in perspective. You have to say, it's coming this way. This way it's wrapping over the top. Another little box down here. Another form coming out from underneath it. And then coming from behind it is this. And you don't see the shadows here because those planes are slightly turned away from you, right? So they're there, but I don't see them. On this side, you see more of the shadow because that plane is turning towards me. And as I break this into two little forms that are basically symmetrical, this one you're going to see more of. This one starts to roll over with a slight bump, which seems insignificant until you realize that dark plane basically comes to here and then disappears because it's going around the side, right? So if you think of it that way, in terms of these forms rolling around each other, it becomes very predictable and very easy. Anyway, so if there are any questions more?
Then when you, because your figures are that subtle, they really kind of turn in. So now you take that and exaggerate it, or.
Yeah, the way I think about that is that if I were to exaggerate this, I would just exaggerate what's already happening. I would say, can we do a pose that's a little more dynamic? It won't take long. Okay, perfect, yeah. So this is great. So I would take this and I would analyze the characteristics of this particular pose and say, you see this big tilt coming over?
Is the ribcage always your starting point?
Always, yeah. I always begin with the ribcage. It's this core of the motion, and since I know I'm gonna kind of take it in the direction I want, I like to start at the center of the motion. And if I'm doing this, you see that angle. So I'm gonna pull that angle, make sure it's really strong so I don't lose the action. I'm gonna find the tilt of the ribcage. You see the collarbone this time is way down here. It's not way up there because we're looking at a perspective like this. So I'm going to make sure I'm catching the effect of the top plane. As I come through here, I'm going to put the pectoral muscles in. And again, look what's happening, right? They've changed completely. Before they were kind of flat. Now they're swooping down again with the perspective. And this really starts to swoop up here because as it comes around to the side, it cuts back. As it comes around to the side, it cuts back. So if you exaggerate those things, there's a great drawing by Rubens, or a great painting in Philadelphia of Prometheus getting eaten by his liver's being eaten by an eagle. And if you look at that, you can see Rubens has done that on that. He's pushed all the volumes just a tiny bit, but each overlapping form as this figure is falling down towards you. you really get the sense of the 3 dimensions of it. Which here on this axis, that's what I would catch. I would make sure that even this bit of the rib cage here, right, that it's really swooping up around the side. The iliac crest again is normally kind of curving down like that. Now you tip it forward and that gets much more dramatic, right? So we're gonna have a really dramatic sweep down from the iliac crest towards the center here. And the great thing about these kind of distortions is if you do them in the right direction, right? Like I said before, you can like shoot at the target and try to be exactly accurate, and there's one point, and if you miss it, you missed it, right? But if you can kind of get into this thing of knowing what the movement is in the form you want to create, you actually have room to push it a little bit, so it becomes a little more flexible. And again with the belly button, right? You see, there it is, I put it there, that's not right. Because I've got to sweep down again around the perspective, so I'm going to bring the belly button a bit lower. So again, in terms of exaggeration, it's a funny kind of a concept, because oftentimes what you think is exaggeration turns out to actually not be as much exaggeration as you think it is. Because again, like I'm saying, your eye will usually underestimate these kind of things because you don't have a mental conception of it, right? You don't have a mental conception of perspective, so you default to your flat mental conception. So when you're drawing a pose like this, you have to really bring everything, the pectorals, the opening of the rib cage, right? Even the muscles up here under the pectorals, they kind of sweep back up and around. Like you work over here. All of this is kind of coming back up and around. So you can basically build on that motion. Again, I would put in he's fairly frontal here, so I'm not actually too worried about that. See the collarbone again, breaks into 3. The deltoid attaches out here. Up here, as we sweep around to the back, see this deltoid feels really high because this side is again sweeping up and back around, right? So everything up here is going to be pulling up really high. So eventually, if you learn this stuff, you can pretty much draw it into the right place without even having to like check that carefully because it's predictable. And if you want to exaggerate, you could say, let's push the perspective a little bit, right? Because now I have this 3-dimensional model. I could simply take the cylinder from being like this, and I can make the cylinder like that, and I could still put all the same points and build the same geometry on it, and make the same thing happen, you know? So that's how you can exaggerate. Once you have that 3D model essentially in your head, you can twist it and turn it a little bit and get away with it. I mean, it's hard to do a whole painting from your imagination, but it doesn't make any sense because you can get models to help you, but you can really educate yourself to where if you do want to turn ahead a little bit, it's not rocket science. You know, you can just, you know what the perspective is, you know the forms, you just twist that center line slightly off or twist it forward in space, which I do all the time because I'll be in the middle of a painting or a drawing and I'll go, okay, I've got like some photo reference or something that I've put aside. Because I'll always start with a drawing from imagination, that's step 1. And then once I have that drawing from imagination, I'll get models if I'm feeling, you know, luxurious, and I want to bring the model in, and I've got the right light and all that kind of stuff, and I've got the right model to decompose, and I'm feeling like, you know, doing that. Or I'll just get a photograph. And either way, I'll then go back to my drawing from imagination, and I'll try to match the model to my drawing from imagination. So that's going to require a little bit of plastic surgery here and there, maybe widening their shoulders, maybe adding some weight to them. And that's where this comes in really handy. If you're doing, say, Christ and Pilate, like the, what is that painting? The Cesare. In the, yeah, take a break. And the PT. And you, let's say you want to paint, you know, Pilate. You want just the right face. You want somebody like very Roman looking, a bit stern, maybe a bit decadent. I mean, you may not be able to find just that model, right? So you have to make a few decisions. You get a model who could be good but close enough, and then you break it down and you say, what are the characteristics? I can soften the jaw a little bit to make it look like he's really been drinking and eating, you know? I can bring out the hook of his nose slightly. And if you think about it, if you've got, again, see that triangle we talked about in perspective? If you've got that, and then let's give this triangle, let's actually do this. Let's give this triangle an underplane. like that, like a wedge of cheese now, right? So if we have that, then we can kind of start to think about this and go, okay, that could be kind of the form of a nose. If we come back like this and we drop that plane down and we drop that down. See, now we've created the nose dropping down. These things are all just perspective. So you can exaggerate that. If I have a form like this, and I know all I have to do is push this line up and change that line to there. Now I've got a much more hooked nose on my character. Right? So it becomes very easy, and you can actually create the form that you need, because you'll almost never find just the right model. I mean, I had one guy, but he was crazy. Polish drunk guy, that was a lot of fun. But you don't usually find exactly the right model. I certainly couldn't use him for Hercules or Jesus or something. And so that's actually where exaggeration is kind of the key point. It's really important. If you want to do Apollo, who's going to pose for Apollo? Not me, not you, not you. You know, we got to find the guy, and then we're not going to find the guy because he doesn't exist. He's a god. You know, if you look at the Canovas or you look at the Apollo Belvedere, that's just form doesn't exist. So you have to build extra symmetry into it, which means getting your geometry right so you can make it a little bit extra symmetrical. That's the classical thing. Everything is built on the geometric forms, and you'll have to streamline the irrelevant forms out of that, which is the neoclassical thing, right? You find the big geometry and then you emphasize it. Where in Baroque, you tend to emphasize the overlaps, and you emphasize the varieties, right? The fact that this side is compressed, so this side is going to bulge here, that this side will stretch, and this side will reach out. That's more Baroque. In a Baroque painting, they tend to push the movement and the drama.
What kind of drills have you found helpful over the years to expedite that learning process of just implicitly understanding the form and how to do it from the shot?
I think, like I said, doing these kind of perspective exercises, they don't have to be like super precise. You know, you don't have to spend a month laying out grids, just practicing with planes. If I make a plane, I cut it in half. What does a form do? What happens to a circle here? These kind of just simple stuff. So you get a conception. Putting simple volumes into perspective, start with cylinders. I would do like the horizon line. And you could start with the classic like Star Wars spaceship thing, right? They're all sort of shooting out from the same point. The ones that you're looking down on. You have a top plane, you can do it with boxes. This is all very simple one-point perspective, let's say. And as you start to get comfortable putting simple forms into perspective, the next thing you can do is take a thing off of perspective. Let's say we have that, like this train car here. And then let's say one of our train cars wants to take off into space. So what I have to do is, as it tilts itself to shoot higher up in the air, let's tilt it like that. Its vanishing point is going to drop down below the horizon. And it's going to turn like this. So the first thing to do is to learn to put basic volumes into space. Spheres, cylinders, boxes, all these kinds of things. Because you'll find then once you have that basic volume, let's just divide that in half. You see you start to get the basic structure of what could give you the outline of a face in perspective, something like this. If you have one here, we could say, let's just make it a little more box-like. Center line over here. Things coming off the center line. So you can kind of put it that way into space. And so this is the basic, most basic kind of simple thought process of it. But as you get better at that and it gets more complex, you just assign it to more forms. If you have let's say we can take this box, let's make another one. Let's put a vanishing point here. Well, that can become the basis of a hand, right? center knuckle, here, the first knuckle, and we have a series of sort of box-like appendages coming off of it in perspective. Now again, this is all very basic, and that's how you can start to conceptualize things, which gets really, really useful once you're comfortable with it. It basically means when you draw a hand, you don't have to sit there and go, shit, this finger, no, is that finger there, is this finger here? Because you can just do the geometry of it. You can build the structure of the hand and do it accurately, you know, find the center line of the hand, make sure that the fingers are sitting on the right place, check the basic proportions of the fingers to the hand, things like that. And you'll know as you come down to here, so let's say you have something like this, right? Well, this is a very tricky perspective to navigate because you have a knuckle here. This finger is going to be turning over. You're going to see only the side plane, but not the fingernail. Coming up to here on the top now, you're going to have the knuckle here instead of in the front. So here the knuckle is there. Here the knuckle is over here. And here, let's kind of draw it up and then back. You're only going to see the front plane of the knuckle before it cuts back. So these are a series of intricate little shifts of perspective that if you don't get them right, your finger's not going to have any character. You're going to feel like you're looking at the knuckles from the wrong angle, and then you're going to have a hand that looks like a thing. It's not going to have the right character because imagine, right, how different it is. You see the knuckle from the front, you see it looking down. They're in completely different locations here, and that's really hard to track exactly right on a live model if their hand is sort of. And that's the other advantage of getting the geometry. If you pin down the center line and the tilt and the axis, even if the model moves, it doesn't matter. You've already decided at really the first 5 minutes on your basic geometry, and from then on, you know exactly. You're not going to chase the stomach muscles and go, oh shit, now they're over here, now they're over here, where are they going? I'm not sure. You've decided exactly from the beginning, because the easiest time to make a decision about the big mass of the body is with the first few lines. There's nothing confusing you and there's nothing in the way. So once you have it, you simply follow that. Even if the model breathes, even if the model is sort of uncomfortable, there's no mystery or wondering whether you're chasing in the right direction or the wrong direction.
I have two other quick questions. So you said that if you have architecture on your canvas, you have to get the perspective correct.
Yes.
I'm assuming you work that out in the drawing. You do small.
Yeah, what you would do, I'll do a really like super primitive mock-up here. The best way is to look at projecting architecture, which means you can create the picture plane and you can watch how things will go into space, right? So let's say we have this. This is going to be really inaccurate. Just take a quick stab at it. Okay, so. So let's imagine that we want to make a column, right? And we're just going to make a sloppy grid. And then we're going to put this column here. Let's give it a base. Let's give it a very simple Flintstones kind of capital. And so I'm going to decide that column is like 1 square wide. See? So I have my grid. I can make it 1 square here. No problem. Now I'm going to bring it up. I'm going to first put the pedestal. So the pedestal is, let's say, 1/2 square. So I create a grid going up. If you can make this out, this is not pretty, but we'll just assume that this is half of a square. So I can come to the side here, and I bring that over, and I've marked exactly the height of half a square. Then these lines go back in perspective to the vanishing point, and they meet the other end of the square there. Now, if I know the shaft of the column is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 squares high, well, I can just come back to here, and I can go to, let's say, this point on the side, and that's the height. I just cut right across here in the center. And I've put it there. And then again, let's say this is 2/3 high. So I come up to here, same thing, back to perspective, bring it out. There's the vanishing point. This is 1 square high again, so it's the same as down here. Very simple, very primitive. But you can kind of create a projection into space that way. You simply take your object, you form the grid, and you put it back into space. And then if you know that a human is, let's just pick a number like about half the height of the column. See, now you mark that human height here, and as you go back, wherever you put him, you have a consistent height for a human being. All the way to the back here, see? Or as you continue to come forward, we can do the same all the way across there. We can mark the height of a human being there. And so you simply grid and project back into space. That's how every Renaissance painting was made, basically. If you notice, they're almost all 1-point perspective. When you go into the churches, you look at the Botticellis, you look at the Raphaels, they finally started to shift into 2-point perspective, which is basically the same thing, but a little more time consuming. So it's better to do what they did and start with simple 1-point perspective, you know.
Sorry, Adam, you use this kind of grid for finding perspective for architecture, but if you say you have like a multi-figure composition or some figures are further back, do you have any ways to like make sure that they make sense by in their side elevation, or do you just ignore that like?
Well, there's 2 ways to go, right? One is like this, which is exact perspective again, which is kind of like drawing the model exactly as it is, right? So if I have another space, and let's say this is not quite as formally figured out, and maybe there's a hill and a pond, and I've got a figure standing here, and I'm not doing real perspective in this, right? What I would do is as I come back up the hill, you know, I'll just kind of like do quick perspective lines, knowing that this is a hill that's going up, so if this is the vanishing point's going to be a little higher, because it's on an angle, you know, you have to throw that ground line up at an angle too. So I can just kind of wheel back quick and easy. Because in these kind of situations, it's very forgiving. You don't have to be scientific and natural things. You just kind of eyeball it, and then if there's a figure halfway here, and say about that, and I move them over, and you can set a figure right in there. So this is just a quick, sloppy vanishing point thing. You don't need a grid for nature. I guess that's my point I'm trying to say. There's no point gridding trees and rocks and things, because the forms are so complex that you can't do it. It only works with regular, predictable forms, right? Because imagine if you had to chart this for every curve on a tree trunk. Crazy. You better just to look at it and draw it.
And then you said that when you do groups of figures, you group them into like larger shapes. So when you have an idea for a painting, are you just like, when you doodle, you just doodle large shapes, abstract shapes, just kind of get a sense of like how the figures might flow together, or?
Sort of. I kind of, I do it a lot of ways. I break it down into lots of little steps. So I start with an idea. I find if I don't know, kind of like I was saying about form, if I don't know what the hell I'm doing, and I just start drawing, I always draw the same scene. I don't know why that is, it's just the scene that's in my head comes out. So I have to start by forcing myself out of my stupid habits. So I come up with an idea, I try to like write down what it's gonna be about, and then think about it. Like, what are the key elements in this scene, right? Like, I was just thinking of doing a box in Ariadne, and I thought, okay, the beach, rocks, dancing, kind of primitive, hippie-looking, wild, drunk people. Let's say Silenus, who will be a kind of big, bearded, fat man. Musical instruments, right? Like, I think of a few different musical instruments. And it's good to kind of stimulate your brain this way. There was a thing I read about the difference between American and English acting methods that I thought was kind of key for that, where they said American acting, they try to get into the psychology of the person. In English acting, traditional Shakespearean, let's say, they just try to get the character and accumulate details that make that character look the way they are, right? It seems more superficial, but I think it's actually more accurate. And you do the same with the scene. Accumulate a bunch of details in your mind. What's connected to making this scene believable? What key details do you need? And then when you start to draw, yeah, you can think about the action. You have to know what the action is going to be, because you can start, making shapes and having a figure falling down here on the floor, and another figure standing over the top of him, strangling him or something like this. And this one's back here running away. You can do all that stuff, but you kind of have to know what you're trying to do, because that's the harder thing. The harder thing is in some ways the drama and the presentation of the scene. And then the flow and the rhythm is just about you start by making simple shapes, right? If I'm going to throw another figure in there, maybe I put one here. Let's say there's another figure here. Let's say there's some trees on the hill, kind of here. So this is the very traditional basis of composition in Renaissance painting from the earliest days, was simple, 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 simple. Maybe there's, a sheep here, let's say. And that's kind of the painting. So they started by avoiding chaos in the scene. They're not throwing arms out in every direction and things happening, because then you end up without beauty, you end up with ugliness. And then as you get a little bit later in time, like with some of the things by Pontormo, they'll still have this, but they'll start to maybe have some of the groups of figures sort of like, they're still tight, right? They're still forming a shape, but that shape might start to float off into space in a weird and surprising way. And so that's where you start to get into a little more experimental composition in that sense, going from basic geometric shapes that can be sort of groups of figures. Like, look at a lot of the Renaissance paintings. You'll be surprised. You'll say, that looks complicated. There's a lot going on. But those figures form a box, almost always. They're tightly, tightly contained in the big shape. Michelangelo's conception was the tightest shape possible, like a block of marble, right? You can't get a more tight shape than a block of marble. But to fill that block of marble with all the energy you can. So that's how you do composition too. You start with a tight shape. If it's a square, if it's something wonky, like Klimt, whatever it is, and then you can kind of fill that shape with a lot of energy, and that gives an organization and a coherence to your space. Because if you do geometry like this, and you don't fill it with variety, what you're going to have is essentially a sort of a cathedral front from the 11th century, right, where the angels are all lined up in the same position. Beautiful. It's like Gregorian chant. But my guess is that's not what you guys want, because you're here. And so if you go Michelangelo, you make everybody there in the same geometry. But then there's twists. One will be like this, the other one will be like that. You'll work oppositions into that structure. So if you go to the Medici tombs, you look, the figures are opposing poses. They couldn't be more different, literally contrapostal. One's leg is going up, the other one's leg is going the other way in contrast to it. But if you look at their silhouettes, the figures on the tomb form a perfect match for each other. So that's unity and variety as it applies to design. So again, give yourself a unity, whatever shape you want, doesn't matter. Fill it with variety and interesting things and hold it together. Anything else? No? All right.
I have one. Most of your stuff is multi-figure, and they're interacting with each other, either fighting or.
Yeah. Okay, that's a concept too. That's what Da Vinci called decorum. And he said when you make a narrative composition, it has to have decorum, which means there's an action. This is the classical conception of tragedy, right? There's one action and everything unifies around that action in your scene. And that's the unity. If somebody is, say you have a crucifixion, everybody's reacting to the crucifixion. Nobody's there reading their phone or something, right? There's a unity, but you have a variety of types of people. Now you could say young people, old people, fat people, thin people, rich people, poor people, whatever story you want to tell. That's your variety in the scene. And the decorum concept in the Renaissance was everybody behaves according to their type. So an old man will behave different than a child in a dramatic situation, right? A rich man maybe will behave different than a poor beggar. So all of these things you factor into your characters. And then you build contrast. That's the other one. You have a fat guy and you have a thin guy. You have like classic comedy duos, right? The tall one and the short one. You always want to contrast within the figures. That's another level of contrapposto. Because what you want in a painting is you have 1 second essentially to sell your effect. And so that relies on contrast. Like if you want light in your painting, what do? You make the stuff dark around it, right? If you want a figure to appear beautiful, well, you can put an ugly guy next to it. That's one way to do it. People have used that trick for a long time. If you want your figure to look very strong, maybe you put somebody very frail next to them, you know? And then that also has a way of focusing your narrative, like getting you to think again, what is this painting actually about? Am I just sticking figures in, or do I have a point here? And that's how you tell your point. That's how you make your point. Is it a political point? Do you want to talk about what kinds of different kinds of people and how they're reacting to something? Is it a more psychological point? Do you want to really get into the emotions, one stoic kind of figure and one overreacting crazy figure? Like, you can kind of make your story and your painting about what you want it to be, but it has to be strong contrast of type. And the more the better too. They used to have a thing for astrology actually, where sometimes they talk about putting every sign from astrology into a painting, and they'd all behave differently and look a little differently.
Do you develop the poses yourself, or do you have a repertory of source?
I take a lot, like when I'm getting into a drawing, and I usually have a point where I'm not completely and totally in love with the way it's going. Then I'll get ideas. I'll go to a museum or get some books out and just look for interesting poses and go, that's a good one, I'll take that. I can use that figure in here. And it's a really good thing to do. I mean, this was the classic. Erasmus wrote a book that I think was based on an ancient version. I don't know if it was Cicero that wrote it, but it was called De Copia. And the idea was for poetry in the Renaissance, the way you learned was called the De Copia. You built an inner house in your mind. And as you walked through the rooms of this house, you took lines of poetry and you classified them. So as you walked through this house, you could train yourself to memorize a vast amount of poetry. And the idea was, they called basically also the mosaic method, that you would pick pieces from good poets and you would recombine those pieces and make a mosaic out of things that you had taken. So you're using the best possible materials. And that's just something that you don't have to do. I don't think. I think it was an interesting idea. They were very mystical about these things. But the practical idea is it shows you a lot of these ideas were coming from other people's sections of their painting, right? Like one great figure in a fresco. You can kind of put that in your mind or sketch it down and then later use it. Rubens did this. I mean, he had a whole notebook of poses classified by different things. Fighting people, running people, drinking people, you know, everything. And that burned up in the 18th century in a fire, I think. But it used to be there. You could look at Rubens' copybook, essentially, that was filled with old masters and models that he had sketched. And then when he wanted to make a painting, he would go in and take from these, kind of like the Woody Allen thing, right? You take all your dumb ideas and you put them in a drawer on cards. When you have to make a new movie, you just pull out 10, and then you stick them together and you've got a movie. So it's the same basic concept.
Just wanted to ask, did you ever do sculpture as well?
Yeah, years ago. I haven't done sculpture in a long time. But a long time ago, yeah. But it was really helpful. Sculpture is great. Sculpture is the best, because what sculpture does is it gives you the conception of the form and the body. The only thing you're missing with sculpture is really perspective. And you even get a sense of light in sculpture, because you start to realize how turning the form actually turns into light and shade too. So that's really useful. Then just throw perspective on it, because if you can sculpt and you know perspective, you can do, you can throw figures and line on it, because it's just form, right? Once you know that form is not that difficult to project into space.
You rely on the way the temperature changes in order to
Yeah, a little bit. I did it more in the past. I go between being very colorful and being not very colorful. It's sort of like I go between drinking a lot and not drinking a lot. It's the same kind of thing. Sometimes you're indulgent and you want to just throw it all out there, and then you go, oh, I don't know, man.
I feel like the other thing you
No more lizard crimson.
I feel like the other thing about it that's really positive effects and
It's easy with a simple palette, right? Because a simple palette, like monochrome's the easiest in the world. You have two choices. Is it lighter? Is it darker? That's it. You know, two directions. Once you start throwing multiple mixtures of color in, now you start to get thousands of choices as far as what you're gonna do. So I try to keep my palette simple because it lets me focus on the drawing. Because I find the drawing is really the thing. Take a stop in like the PT and look again at how simple the palettes are on these pieces. Some of them are like, Bronzino has figures that look like just burnt umber with a little glaze on the lips and in the corners of the eye. And you don't even notice. You'll never notice because it's so well modeled and the values are so good and the form is so perfect that you don't, color is nice, but I feel like color is like, how would I describe it? It's like a beautiful person that's not very intelligent, you know? They're not gonna like carry the party. You can invite them and they'll sit on the couch and they'll look good, but they're not the main attraction, you know? Yeah. So. Anything else? All right. Good.